What's up, gang? Thanks for listening to the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson. My guest today is an anthropologist at the Danish Institute for International Studies and co-author of a fascinating new article in the Journal of Contemporary Asia called Living with Revolution, the Everyday Experiences of Myanmar's Gen Z Revolutionaries. Justine Chambers, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. It's nice to reach out across the ocean.
Yeah, the time zone thing we're playing with here is ridiculous for people who don't know. Denmark's not anywhere near New Zealand. So
That's correct.
I wanted to sort of give credit to your co-author up front, and I might say his name wrong, but like Saw Ner Dhu, is that right?
Saw Ner Dhu, yeah.
So his story as Burmese Gen Z at the time of the coup was part of this research, and we both really wanted him here for this conversation. But there's some logistical and scheduling realities around the distance and where he is and everything. So I just want to shout him out and note that like he's here in spirit. He's not being excluded or appropriated or anything.
No, I'm glad you brought that up because I also just wanted to start the conversation by acknowledging both him as my co-author, but also just generally this article is it was a really collaborative piece. It came out of his experience, and he's someone I've known for more than 10 years, and
Oh, wow.
he's not just a co-author, he's a very close friend of mine and also a student of mine. So he's currently conducting field work in Southeast Myanmar and was unable to join because he doesn't have access to internet. So I was really disappointed he wasn't able to join today because I think he would have brought a really unique perspective to this conversation, but I will try and do justice to both his experience, but generally the conversations we raise in the article.
Yeah, cool. Okay. So Myanmar is one of the few places in the world that actually is experiencing a revolutionary conjuncture. And I feel like a lot of people are A, not really aware of that, but also B, generally, there's an extremely steep learning curve when it comes to Myanmar politics for Western audiences, especially. And so I wonder if you could just set us up with a brief introduction to Myanmar history to get us started.
Yeah, I mean, look, if I was going to go into detail about Myanmar's history, it would take a long
Yeah.
time. But I guess to just give you a brief snapshot, Myanmar was under colonial rule for less than 100 years. And then there was an independence movement that came sort of amidst, but off the back of World War II. After gaining independence, Myanmar soon after became ruled by the military junta, who stayed in power effectively until 2012, when they ushered in this so-called, what they referred to as a transition to democracy. And the 2010s really saw a lot of significant social, political, and economic reforms in place, including the release of political prisoners, reduction of censorship laws, and importantly, the release of the democratic icon Aung San Suu Kyi, who'd been under house arrest for about 20 years. And after that, they, ushered in these democratic processes, including elections. And in 2015, the Aung San Suu Kyi's party, the National League for Democracy, was voted in. And after 5 years of NLD rule, the military launched a coup in February 2021 after the NLD was re-elected in November 2020. So I think, in thinking about this particular revolutionary moment of Myanmar's history, it's really important to consider the historical dynamics. Not only was Myanmar ruled for, almost 60 years by the military, but also during that period and up until today, there have always been civil wars in Myanmar's borderlands. And these civil wars have been led particularly by ethnic minority leaders and activists who have been fighting for autonomy and for ethnic rights and self-determination for decades. And so, this revolution doesn't just sort of come out of a historical vacuum. It builds off revolutionary conflicts and warfares that have been occurring since independence in 1948.
That's perfect. Yes. That's the setup we need because, well, we'll talk about it later, but there's such a tendency to think of revolutions because they're so ruptural as events that just spring up, and that's never how anything works, It's like there's always a
Yeah.
context. Um,
Definitely, and I think, like, particularly the article that, my co-author and I wrote, it's, really embedded in the lives of young activists in Karen State, which is in southeast Myanmar, and Karen people have been victims of violence, for many decades, as part of, this sort of counter, uh counterinsurgency operations from the Myanmar military against what is known as the Karen National Union, and that's an ethnic, armed, but also primarily a political and governance organization that has been fighting for Karen rights, since the 1940s. So, I think particularly in thinking about this article, we really wanted to highlight that, even though this generation is unique from previous generations, they are also deeply aware of the injustices that have been experienced by generations past.
yeah, that's actually a good setup for a question I had because you mentioned in the article that youth and social movements have been a big part of Myanmar's political history. So, like, I guess in snapshot form again, like, how did youth activism matter in the past, like before 2021?
Yeah, I think, look, I mean, I guess if you look at literature on youth and revolutions, youth all over the world play a really key role in revolutionary moments and events. If we think about, the storming of the Bastille in France, in the Cuban revolutions, in,
Mhm.
anti sort of colonial revolutions. But in
China.
Myanmar, youth have always really played this key political role. The independence leader, Bajo Aung San, was a student youth revolutionary. A lot of the leaders of the ethnic armed organizations were youth revolutionaries. Um, Famously, in 1988, students protested against the military at the time, and they were brutally suppressed by the Myanmar military. Thousands of people were killed. Many fled to the borders with Thailand, in particular. Others joined resistance movements, particularly ethnic resistance movements. But yeah, youth have kind of always held this status in Myanmar as politically, I guess pushing the boundaries of politics. And even during the 2010s, youth played a really critical role in, I guess, pushing the reform process, I think personally, further than what the military, I guess, wanted or expected from the people.
So that's good. What what were the events that you mentioned how Aung San Suu Kyi's party, the NLD, wins re-election in November 2020, and
Yeah.
then February 2021 is the coup. What
Mhm.
was going on there? And what were the demands of the protesters in response to the coup initially?
Yeah, so I mean, there after the November 2020 election, the Myanmar military, I guess, leaders and the military affiliated party, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, the USDP, they started sort of making these announcements in public around the elections being fraudulent. And that's not to say the elections were perfect, particularly as they were conducted during COVID.
Yeah,
There were a lot
of
of
course.
issues that made holding the elections in the first place very difficult. But for all intents and purposes, what international observers were able to see, it was an open election, and these claims to that the election was fraudulent are completely incorrect, and they don't have any basis. So I guess, especially in the lead up to the coup on February 1, there was a lot of rumors and scaremongering and fear from people that the military would take over. And in February 1st was actually the day that NLD parliamentarians were supposed to, take their seats for the first time after the election. And so you had all these members of parliament who were in Naypyidaw, the capital of Myanmar, and the military forces went house to house arresting people. They arrested journalists, they arrested activists, any critical sort of voices, student and labor unionists. And within a matter of days, thousands of people were on the streets protesting against the military, against this clear, blatant grab for power. And particularly at the beginning, there were calls for the release of Aung San Suu Kyi, the
Mhm.
state councillor who holds a lot of sort of moral authority and popularity in Myanmar, but also the president, U Win Myint, and other MPs. Initially, the calls were really for the return to democracy. But within a matter of days, weeks, partly because of the role of youth, but also because of the role of ethnic activists, young women as well played a really big role in the protests. Labor unionists as well. I really want to point out their role. I guess the goals of the protests really radically transformed to much more revolutionary demands about the overall transformation of society. It was about the complete removal of the military from politics. During the 2010s, the military still effectively had strong control over politics and the economy, including 25% of seats in parliament. And so it was really for this radical transformation. And increasingly, these goals also came to coalesce around recognition of injustices against particularly ethnic minority communities, including the
Mhm.
Rohingya. And so you saw all these public statements coming out recognizing, the violence that had been committed against the Rohingya in Rakhine State. The Rohingya, famously were victims of genocidal actions in 2017, where more than 800,000 people fled to neighboring Bangladesh. And this just general legacy of violence against both ethnic and religious minorities in the country, and calls for a genuine federal democracy, which in itself was revolutionary. So and particularly the calls from young people for the removal of the patriarchal military dictatorship.
And there was a general strike as part of this too, right? That was
Yes. So I think that's also just, where we are now, more than 3 years after the coup, there is, an armed revolutionary warfare that's taken over the whole country. But I think it's really important to go back to those initial sort of moments, that came after the coup. People came out onto the thousands, and I mean, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people came out onto the streets. It was very peaceful. People came out in beauty queen dresses and dinosaur costumes and superhero costumes. They were like joking and laughing. There was songs. There was a sort of a lot of humor to the protests, particularly sort of mocking the military leaders. And things really descended because of the military, because of the use of violence, increasingly as they started to use first rubber bullets and then live rounds on these peaceful protesters. And that's really when we saw this radical transformation. But as you mentioned, you know the civil disobedience movement was also a really key part of the sort of non-violent resistance movement of the revolution. So um, hundreds of thousands of civil servants refused to work for the Military State Administration Council. And so really, it started as a non-violent protest movement, and it really descended because of the military and its use of violence against peaceful people, peaceful protesters.
yeah, I remember when all this was happening, there's I mean, on the left, there's often a discourse about, like, the ineffectiveness of sanctions. It's such a crude tool, it's a pathway to
Mm,
war, like, and that's generally all of that's true, actually. But, there is a question of, like, what are the people most affected on the ground actually wanting? Because there are
mhm,
situations where they call for sanctions, and I remember the first jarring thing where I was like, "Oh, this shit is different this time," is that we were seeing calls from in Myanmar from labor unions saying boycott, sanction, divest effectively,
Yeah.
cut off the junta from all funds, and they're cutting off the junta from their labor too. So
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there is no one perspective, and I think it's really important to keep that in mind. I mean, first of all, there is no one person that speaks for this revolutionary movement.
mhm,
It is a horizontal movement. It's not led by one leader, um, and there are different goals and aspirations. But generally, the Myanmar suffered extraordinarily under economic sanctions for many decades
mhm,
because of the Myanmar military, and because of the West's, I guess, in the use of sanctions by the West in particular, and the US as well. And so we can see that those sanctions didn't really necessarily have an effect, but actually mostly affected ordinary people. And levels of poverty were extremely high for many decades. So there is definitely a question about the efficacy of sanctions, but I think generally people would argue that we need to sort of cut the military off at all points. And
mhm,
particularly at the moment, there are calls for stopping the selling of jet fuel, for example, to the Myanmar military from countries such as Singapore and Thailand and Russia and China, because of the use of airstrikes against largely civilian populations. So I think there's a big question around the use of sanctions, how effective they actually are, but the people themselves are also sanctioning the government both through their actions in sort of through the civil disobedience movement, but also,
mhm.
as you mentioned, they also had boycotts against military-owned products such as like beer companies, telecoms companies, but over the course of the last 3 years, it's become incredibly difficult to maintain a lot of those boycotts and strikes against the military simply by virtue of, the violence the military continues to enact on people who sort of demonstrate any form of activism against them.
Yeah, yeah. And the period of liberalization, which was, I guess, 2011-ish to 2020,
Hmm.
militarized violence was still happening in this period of liberalization. The genocidal actions against the Rohingya was during this
Hmm.
period of
Hmm.
liberalization, right? There's a contradiction there. But I have a question about the US in this. So in 2011, 2012, incidentally, or maybe not incidentally, this is what I want to ask. Like,
Hmm.
this is when the US announces the pivot to Asia and the Obama
Hmm.
administration, right? One of the things it did at that time in the name of kind of countering China was opening up relations with Myanmar.
Hmm.
And this became extremely problematic once, genocide is happening because we're
Hmm.
still basically engaging in that same way. But the question I have, and that I've never been sure about, is how much did America's opening to Myanmar matter for
Hmm.
either the military, the ruling regime, for life on the ground? As a counterfactual, do you have the period of liberalization if America never turned around in 2011?
Hmm.
Like what do you have? What are your thoughts about all of that?
Yeah, look, I think, I mean, it's hard to make guesses about, what could have happened if America had a different policy. I think,
Sure.
of course, it played a really significant role in really speeding up the reform process. Clinton and Obama famously went to Myanmar in 2011 and 2012. They were really keen, I think, particularly to engage with Aung San Suu Kyi, who sort of had this. Uh, she had the Nobel Peace Prize. She was this democratic icon. She was known for peaceful protests,
Mhm,
peaceful resistance against the Myanmar military for many decades. And she was really held up as this icon. And I think, US leaders really latched onto her once she was released from prison. Um, but I think it's really important not to put too much, I guess, emphasis on the role of the US because I think this transition was ultimately led by the military. The 2008 Constitution really, set the path for this. They were talking about a military-led transition to democracy from 2003.
mhm,
Um, And so I think, you know, particularly in 2008, after the 2008 constitution, but also really devastating Cyclone Nargis, where more than 140,000 people were killed, we really saw changes in Myanmar, both coming from the military and I guess reformers within the establishment, but still really making sure that the military controlled politics and power and the economy. So really shoring up their position in both, you know, the country's political system, but also economic sort of holdings. Um, and I think, you know, if we reflect on the last 10 years, like there's no doubt that, you know, prior to the coup, things really rapidly changed in Myanmar. But and of course, like the US and other Western countries played a role in that opening up, particularly if we think about increase in foreign investment and, you know, the push towards, you know, say opening up of censorship laws or opening up towards, you know, access to mobile phones and 3G and 4G technology. I think there's no denying the influence of that. But I also really think that I guess part of what went wrong is that we held too much, or when I say we, I mean like the West held a little bit too much, I guess, symbolic capital in Aung San Suu Kyi in particular,
Yeah.
as this sort of democratic icon, as a symbol of human rights. Um, I mean, there's no denying that the military still really controlled the levers of power while she was in power from 2016 onwards, when the sort of genocide against Rohingya communities occurred. But you know, there was also ongoing conflicts in Kachin and Shan State. You know, like land grabs were continuing in big parts of the country from sort of military actors or military actors associated with the military. Um, and you know, I think there is this sort of, I guess, disjuncture between what we hoped for and actually the realities of what it takes to come out of, you know, 50, 60 years of military rule, 50, 60 years of civil conflict. Grievances didn't just go away. Things didn't magically just sort of change overnight. And I think, you know, a lot of people sort of got wrapped up in the hope of Aung San Suu Kyi becoming the leader of the country, rather than actually acknowledging the complexities and the realities on the ground of, you know, things were still very difficult for ordinary people. Poverty levels were still high.
Mhm.
Definitely there was changes, but I think a lot of people sort of ignored some of the complexities of this so-called transition to democracy.
Yeah, I think that vibes with my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also really easy to see now after the coup occurred, right? So I think there was so much shock, particularly when the military leaders first took power in February 2021, and I myself I was completely didn't understand why the military would have gone about that, given how much the country had changed over the course of the last, you know, over the 2010s. And the military benefited from those changes, but I also don't think they expected the people to rise up in the way that they did. I think they
Mhm.
thought, you know, through these classic use of tactics of violence, they could, you know, quell the protesters. But as we know, 3 years on, it didn't work.
Yeah, I mean, if nothing else, they had a habit of using force as the final arbiter of things, which is
Right.
obviously
Yeah.
not. Yeah. Um,
And I think it's important to remember history because, like a lot of the institutions of violence that the military relies on, actually come from colonial forms of domination and laws that go back to the colonial period. So the Myanmar military learned how to be violent through the British, and I think it's really important to always remember that legacy of violence. You know, that they built from, and the way that they continue to, you know, engage in brutal, violent counterinsurgency operations against ethnic armed organizations for, you know, 50 years, but mostly against civilian populations, and the fact that people have had to live with those, you know, continue to live with those legacies even during the 2010s.
yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Um, on the issue of, you know, where the revolution came from, in rich countries like the US, you know, I mean, I know people personally who would call themselves revolutionaries, or they identify that way sometimes, or they invoke that rhetoric even. And generally it's kind of unserious, you know, it's it's a posturing if nothing else, but it's the part of the reason I find it unserious is, A, I'm skeptical about the efficacy of violence just as a
Mhm.
tool if your goals
Mhm.
are humanist in some way, which we'll
Yeah.
talk about that later, I think, 'cause I have a question about that. But, the
Mhm.
other reason I find it weird to talk about revolution when you're living in New York or whatever is that revolutions are literally only possible under certain rare circumstances. And I think generally the conditions in rich countries are not favorable to that. And I don't even know if you want conditions that are favorable to revolution, honestly. And so, without getting into like sociology or comparative politics,
Mhm. Mhm.
how would you describe what were the ingredients of Myanmar's
Mhm.
revolutionary conjuncture? Like, what made it possible in 2021? You've hinted at some of it already. I mean, like,
Yeah.
decades of violence are certainly something.
A lot of sort of literature on revolutions, particularly looks at class politics and the role of, I guess, workers and workers up like creating an uprising against, political elite. And I think what's so interesting about this, I guess, revolutionary situation is that it's quite different from other revolutions in terms of its goal. It's not necessarily, it's class politics is part of it, but it's also about sort of removing these long legacies of military sort of authoritarianism, patriarchalism within the system of political rule, including issues related to the hegemony of the Burma majority, Buddhist Burma majority in sort of politics, as well. So it's about a real transformation of society at all levels. And again, like that's really been led by, I think, young people, by ethnic activists, by labor unionists, women in particular played a really key role. I also wrote an article on the role of young women in this Spring Revolution with another set of really incredible
Hmm.
female co-authors. But I think like what really set the stage for this revolutionary movement is it does come off the back of decades of violence, and I think during the 2010s, young people really became aware of I guess some of those structures of violence, and that's not to say they necessarily experienced it themselves, but there was a lot more education. There was huge expansion of access to information, and that partly came through access to digital communications technologies, particularly 4G technology. There was access to more educational opportunities, right? So prior to 2011-12, Myanmar was really closed in terms of its education, in terms of its access to information. That's not to say it was closed off from the rest of the world. In other ways, migration has always been occurring in Myanmar. I think it's important to
Yeah.
acknowledge that. But especially in terms of sort of the everyday experience, it really rapidly transformed. I remember, I first visited in 2012, and people didn't have access to phones at all. And I think a SIM card cost the equivalent of 160 USD. And
Jeez.
within 2 years, like 80% of the population had access to phones. So it really changed overnight in terms of their access to information. And I think, as I mentioned, like young people also really played a key role in pushing the reform process, pushing for the rights of women, for LGBTQI communities, around education reform, like deeper seated reforms. And because a lot of these, activists, labor unionists really played a role in leading the sort of protest movement after the coup, it really also pushed, I guess, the revolutionary goals much further, I think, than previous generations were able to. And partly, again, it was to do with, the spread of information, particularly, just in the weeks after the coup, images and stories and conversations were spreading like wildfire between generations of this history of violence, and this would be the generation that actually saw true transformational change. They were the generation that had had the most access to opportunities, access to the outside world, access to information in particular, and they could really see, like in all of the interviews my co-author and I did, there's such a strong narrative of people sort of finally seeing the truth of really just acknowledging the role the military had played in blinding society to its inherent violence. So I think like it really came off this period of change and transformation, and for the military to sort of just take it away, by standing up and saying, now we're going to rule the country under a state of emergency. People were outraged, they were shocked, they were horrified. And I think, again, coming back to Generation Z, it was just watching their aspirations, their hopes for the future being totally ripped from them. And I think, they didn't lead the revolution on their own, but I think, it was born off the back of this decades of violence and the sort of coming together of different generations over these experiences, and the desire to remove the military from sort of all aspects of political and social life.
So like a genuine, I mean, in my language, that's almost like a progressive revolution, like
Mm,
actual demilitarized, nonviolent
yeah,
society. You're rectifying imbalances of power within society, trying to achieve some measure of like intersectional equality, democracy.
definitely.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I think
It's not
really
about like a
important.
vanguard of some kind, right?
No, and I think like it's important to keep that in mind because in March and April we saw hundreds of thousands of youths flee to sort of rural areas and to areas controlled by these ethnic armed organizations that had long been resisting the military.
Mhm.
And of course, one could argue, like the experience of violence creates, further forms of violence. And that's not to say that revolutionary actors are perfect, sort of, armed actors where they don't commit acts of violence. They certainly have. But if we compare the Myanmar military to the resistance, they are following international norms. They are treating political prisoners, with care and respect. They are, they're following international norms and human rights, generally.
Mhm.
I'm not saying that there aren't some incidences where that is not the case, but
Yeah, yeah.
and generally the rhetoric from particularly the People's Defence Forces, the groups that formed after the military coup, they talk about returning to the civilian fold. They don't want to be armed actors for the rest of their lives. They are also sort of instituting civilian initiatives, administration systems, access to justice. In the areas I work under the Korean National Union, they're actually expanding access to justice in the areas they work. They have judges, they have systems of, systems in place to actually, deal with, you know, any sort of form of any criminal matters, whether that's related to acts of violence by soldiers, and on the other side, we see the Myanmar military is able to behave with complete impunity. The
Mhm.
acts of violence that they've committed against civilians have been completely barbaric and brutal. They've been bombing schools, hospitals. Last year, there was this video imagery of these two young guys who were hung up and tortured and burnt alive with Myanmar military soldiers laughing in the background. So I think you can't compare the
Jesus.
two. You can't compare the two. So I guess movements, because the Myanmar military is intent on destroying the resistance through acts of barbarity and violence, whereas the Myanmar resistance actors are really fighting for a new world, for a new country, for a new foundation that really, at its core, is about transforming the system.
Yeah, that's great. That's great clarification too. In the article, you say that the immediate wake of the 2021 coup was full of a repertoire of like nonviolent resistance tactics, and this like the youth movement kind of wielding that.
Hmm.
What were some of those tactics, and then what compelled the escalation to violence or moving to the mountains? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it was like a really, I guess, I think people were really like afraid of potential violence from the military, knowing the military, but it was also
Sure.
this really hopeful and exciting time where people were out on the streets. There was the coordinated beating of cooking pots at 8 o'clock every night, and that's a sort of gesture to cultural sort of understandings of warding off evil spirits in Myanmar.
Mm.
There was like the use of the three-fingered salute of the Hunger Games. There was, you know, I'm not sure if you've read as well of the use of the tamane, which is like a sarong, a female sarong. They strung those sarongs up across the city as a way to prevent the military from attacking young protesters, and that is about the belief that men shouldn't walk underneath the sarongs of women because they're seen as dirty, and they, it's seen to take away from the power or pone of a man. So you're really using these like super incredible symbolic gestures to,
Very
I guess,
creative,
thwart, creative to thwart the military. They also sort of created this, they created these alliances as well with other anti-authoritarian movements, particularly what's referred to as the milk tea alliance, which is, people who drink bubble tea.
Thailand and
So against, with Taiwan and Hong Kong and Thailand. This also included really creative strikes like the labor strikes we've already talked about, but also silent strikes. They also have, collective car breakdown strikes. So like, taxis were just like collectively breaking down. And again, this was all to sort of thwart the military from being able to like access the protesters. They had cursing ritual ceremonies led by spirit masters. So it was like a really kind of hopeful, creative time. A lot of the signs from protesters were really witty and funny. I guess mocking the Myanmar military leaders. There was images of the senior general Min Aung Hlaing put on the street, and people were walking over, his face, because again, that's seen to sort of diminish his power. But it really radically changed. Because of the military's use of violence and starting to use live rounds into these sort of peaceful protests, and that's when we saw young people really arming themselves, building these sort of handmade barricades, and then gradually we saw a huge collection of people moving to rural areas, joining ethnic armed organizations to train, and I guess creating these people's defense movement forces against the military. And I think what's so different about this particular movement compared to, say, other periods or revolutionary moments in Myanmar's past is that it really it grew also in the Bamar heartland, so the majority Bamar people. So particularly, we've seen very strong resistance in the central Sagaing and Magway regions, where previously there was not a strong resistance. Previously, like a lot of the resistance has centered around the borderlands in ethnic areas dominated by ethnic minority communities, but really we saw the Bamar community really coming together to join, the sort of ethnic resistance forces to defeat the military as well.
man. So the mode of resistance obviously had to shift in the face of actual violence.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely. And I think it's important to just remember that, right? Like, of course, I would never, I'm not someone that is a proponent of violence, but I think like the military really forced people's hands. Young people, like all the young people I've spoken to, even those that are part of People's Defense Forces, they don't want to be, part of an armed resistance movement. They want their old lives back. They want to just be living the lives of, typical 18 to 25-year-olds.
Soldiers' lives suck, man.
Yeah, it really does suck. And
it does.
It sucks also, like, in Myanmar, the resistance of basically living in the forest. They don't have a lot of food. It's rainy season half the year, so it's wet and cold, and they like exposed to, malaria and other sort of diseases, and and then it's the hot season, and they're being pummeled by the Myanmar military, who has definitely stronger defense weapon systems, particularly in terms of air power. So I think like the courage and the hope and the strength shown by the young armed resistance leaders is just so, I don't know, for me it's really powerful, and also a source of hope as well, I think, for like what a future Myanmar could look like.
That's great. A lot of the research was kind of unique in this article because there was like rich descriptions of quotidian aspects of revolutionary life. The goals are idealistic. I
Yeah.
mean, peace, equality, democracy on some level, but it's also this inglorious daily struggle,
Yeah.
latrines, logistics, financial support, all this stuff.
Yeah.
Just it's unsexy. W- what kind of what does it look like to have to wear all that every day? The toll that that takes of like long-term guerrilla warfare. Just like
Mm.
what's the what's the vibe? What is that?
Yeah. I guess, I mean, part of the reason that inspired me to write this article was, I've been working on Myanmar since 2014. And so I have like, and particularly when I first did fieldwork, I had a lot of strong connections with young university students who are part of sort of Generation Z. And I saw this like rapid transformation overnight where you had, I guess people in their early 20s enjoying life. I'm not saying it was all easy. There was definitely challenges. And then overnight, they became leaders of this protest movement. And my co-author, who has long been a close friend of mine, soon had to run, escape from the authorities because he was leading the resistance movement in his hometown. He was then building a camp for political dissidents, for other young people fleeing both from Karen State but other parts of the country as well. There was a lot of young people at that time fleeing to different parts, to territories controlled by particularly ethnic armed organizations like the Karen National Union, which is the area we're talking about. And I think at the start it was really exciting and hopeful, and they really believed that this generation would really, defeat the military. And they thought it would happen in a couple of months because the whole country had really come together to sort of, I guess, protest against the military. But then, of course, it escalated into armed violence, and the reality of that really set in over the course of the rainy season, living in sort of jungle camps, removed from their families, and little access to Wi-Fi, little access to even information. You don't necessarily always know what's happening. And I guess we talk as well about how like boredom sets in.
Yeah.
COVID, a really like terrible wave of COVID spread through Myanmar also in July, August 2021, where lots of people died. There was no access to oxygen. There was no access to basic medical supplies. So you had all these young revolutionaries in these camps who both wanted to defeat the military, but could also watch the military literally withholding oxygen and basic medical supplies from their parents or grandparents in sort of other in sort of areas controlled by the government, and
Mhm.
dying. And so I think this also created a lot of fear, and for me, as someone who was outside the country, I was just like messaging and talking to people every day and checking in on them. And for my co-author, I was also quite worried he would join the resistance because yeah, I mean, I didn't want him to be just another dead young revolutionary. Yeah, so it was like really hard to watch, and still is really hard to watch, right? Young people's lives have been so radically transformed, and we talk a lot about the sort of everyday frustration and fear and sadness and loss that young people have really experienced, at the same time as, I guess, their courage and their hope and their strength, and they're really resolved in their desire to overthrow the military. Um, and I think a lot of literature sort of talks about these moments of revolution. I guess if we think about particularly after the coup, the sort of protest movement. But what
Mhm.
we really wanted to highlight was the sort of dead times of the revolution. So this revolutionary situation is, I guess, what we refer to it as, has been going on for 3 years. And I think it, for people who are involved in the camps, or for young people who are just living in the cities under military rule, there's so many waves of different emotions. Sometimes you feel hope, and sometimes you feel sadness, and sometimes you feel frustrated. A lot of young people really just want this sort of revolution to be over and to go back to their old lives. There's
Yeah,
a
of
lot of
course.
questions about, how long is this going to last? Is it going to be 10 years? Am I no longer going to be a youth when this revolution is over? Am I going to have lost my youth? And I think a lot of young people have really lost their youth, particularly if you think about those sort of young people in this like 15, 16, 17 who joined the armed revolutionary movement. And we also talk about, even though there's a lot of focus on the armed resistance movement as this sort of revolutionary vanguard, there are also just, hundreds of thousands of young people who have to live under the sort of under military rule in areas controlled by the military. And initially after the coup, young people also were boycotting educational institutions run by the military. So university education, but also just high school and primary school education as well. But we've seen, again, it's because it's taking so long. There's a question of like, how do we create a future? Do we just sit at home and wait for the revolution to be over? There's actually a great article by a colleague of mine, Francesca Chu, who talks about waiting as a form of revolutionary resistance. Because there are so many people waiting, young people waiting for the revolution to be over, and they're not necessarily directly participating in armed violence or strike movements, but they are just sitting at home and not going to school, not going to university, and it's been really, really difficult, particularly if we think about the economic hardship that's sort of ensued after the coup. Myanmar's economy has completely fallen to pieces, especially coming off the back of COVID as well.
Yeah.
And so many young people have like joined the resistance. They've also been forced to go to other countries as migrant laborers. But especially this year, I think that the difficulty of this situation for youth has been even further highlighted because the Myanmar military has recently enforced conscription laws, and so that's all young people aged 18 to 35 are like viable for conscription into the military. And so now you have all these young people in military controlled areas who sort of sit at home waiting. They're not necessarily actively, involved in the armed resistance, that they support the revolution in other ways, but they might even be conscripted to the military and forced to fight against their peers. And so I think it's a really, in a lot of ways, like I sort of mentioned it, we mentioned at the end of the article, hope is a really strong theme in all the conversations I have with young people, because I think they have no other option. They have to have hope.
Yeah.
Because there is no other option. They're not willing to negotiate with the military. I mean, the military doesn't want to negotiate with them either. But the sort of
It's a
acts of
fucking brutal
brutality against
situation,
people.
man.
Yeah. So I think like, even one of the young women I was talking to, she's she's involved in creating fake relationships with Myanmar military soldiers. And if I think about the psychological toll of spending every single day creating relationships with soldiers to try and then create a relationship and then get them to defect to the resistance, like what kind of toll that would take on you as a young woman, um, you know to be constantly talking to these military actors who I guess glorify violence, who who have also a history of using sexual violence as well against women. And I like, every time I talk to young people, I don't know how they continue to have hope, but they still do. Yeah.
Man. Yeah. This is inglorious.
Yeah.
Also, Dead Times of the Revolution as a phrase, you should probably put that one in your pocket. It's a compelling phrase in terms of like giving a sense of what's going on in a very pithy way. Okay. Just the whole it creates such a heavy heart feeling, I'm like,
Yeah.
but this is
It's a heavy
also,
subject.
yeah, like that's what grabbed me. I can't tell you how many journal articles I read that for my vocation that make my eyes glaze over, or I'm like, why does this matter? And like
Yeah.
reading I mean, maybe it's because you're an anthropologist, but like reading your article with your co-author, it was like, oh my God, we have to get this into larger
Thank
hands,
you. Yeah.
Um,
No, I mean, look, I do. I mean, personally, as an anthropologist, I think bringing to life the stories of people really helps to, I guess, just remind you of the humanity of this situation. That
mhm,
this isn't just like a mass of people from the developing world that we don't care about. They're individuals. They had hopes. They had aspirations. They've got families. They've got familial expectations. A lot of young people I know also just struggle with this. Should I, be supporting the revolution, or should I be working to support my parents because that's part of my sort of expectation and role as a young person? And yeah, I mean, I just think the sort of sacrifices that people have made are extraordinary. I personally feel quite a strong, psychological, mental toll from the work I've been doing, but to actually be from Myanmar, to have, what's happening to the country to have occurred to you, to your family, to your lives, to your friends, it's unimaginable. And yeah, I mean, I think that's also just what inspires me to keep working on Myanmar and to continue working with all the incredible people I know, scholars, activists, ordinary people as well. They're like the sacrifices they're constantly making. I know for every day that I feel really busy, I'm not doing half of what these people are dealing with. Like most of my friends that are also scholars, they also are raising funds for the resistance. They're looking after family members. They're trying to raise funds for medical needs for IDPs. So they're just engaged in so many different forms of action to support both the revolution resistance movement, but also people who are really just struggling now to survive in the country. Yeah.
mhm. Man, um, so Frantz Fanon has this famous book, of course, The Wretched of the Earth.
Mhm.
The most famous chapter in it, I think, is the opening chapter, which is easily read, I mean, probably rightly, I guess, as a defense of violence if it's
Mhm.
in the name of liberation or
Mhm.
self-determination. And there's a logic there. Like at a certain point, violence becomes necessary to correct
Mhm.
relations of domination that emerge from an
Mhm.
imbalance of power.
Mhm.
And there's a chapter though that is at the end of that book
Mhm.
that's
Mhm.
almost a contradiction in a way, if
Mhm.
reading it and pairing with the first chapter where he's talking about
Yeah.
this, like, the psychic damage to the
Yeah.
souls of the Algerians who had to fight for freedom against France, and these
Yeah.
Algerian kids who, murdered their friend, and then they're almost remorseless about it, or, like, they can't process, like, why is that an issue, like, and
Mhm.
it's this sign that, like, those kids and their humanity, it gets damaged, like,
Mhm.
what does this sustained violence do to a political movement? What does it do to a society? And
Mhm. Mhm.
so you're kind of, like, grappling with this all, in some way, in a way that I've never seen anybody intersect with it, and
Mm.
I don't even know if I have, like, a precise question here, but, like, what are your thoughts about this tension or whatever between, like, peace by violent means is a
Mm.
contradiction in a way,
Mhm.
but there are
Mhm.
situations where violence is, like, the only hope out, and,
Mhm.
like, clearly that's what happened to the resistance movement in Myanmar, like, if you're getting
Yeah.
fucking shot at, what do
Mhm.
you like, you can't just be funny anymore, like, you gotta do something to
Yeah.
respond,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Although they are still funny, there's still lots of witty
That's
memes coming out.
thank Christ. Thank God.
Yeah.
That that's beautiful. So what are your thoughts about this? This is a meta
Yeah.
issue, I suppose, but
Yeah.
it's anchored in the real?
Yeah, look, I mean, I've also grappled with this quite a lot in thinking about the situation in Myanmar, because I am certainly not an advocate of violence, and I spend a
Mhm,
lot of my life, I guess, thinking about and theorizing the impacts of violence on society, as well, and I guess what impact that's had, particularly on Myanmar people. Um, yeah, I mean, I think in going, to Fanon, I think some theorists think there is a paradox in his thinking, and which his argument, like you said, begins as this sort of celebration of revolutionary violence, and then he sort of draws this attention to the corrupt and debilitating effects of violence, and on sort of both the perpetrators and the victims. And of course, we can also see that in Myanmar. Like, I mean, you know, I think, you can see that some especially young people, like what kind of effect is this situation going to have on them, and we can see some of the PDF groups, I guess using their power in the wrong ways. There's been, I guess, some violence against people who are suspected of being spies,
Mm.
and there's not proper sort of judicial processes always in place. Um, and I mean, I'm anti-violence generally. Like, I mean, and I'm anti militaries generally as well. So I think it's really tricky in somewhere like Myanmar, where the institutions that are against the military are inherently militarized as well, right? Even ethnic armed organizations, they're military organizations.
Mhm.
But I guess what gives me hope is just that the institutions that people, I guess, the leaders and generally, those that we speak to in the armed resistance movement, what they profess to build is something better. They aren't, wanting to, create another sort of form of military authoritarianism, or there. And I think what's also interesting about this particular revolutionary movement is there is no one leader who, I guess, say in other revolutionary movements you've seen revolutionary leaders turn into sort of authoritarian dictators. This is quite a horizontal movement. It contends with so many different factions, partly because of sort of the ethnic diversity of the country and these long-running ethnic resistance movements, but also sort of, the role of civil society, of youth activists, of, other forms of activism as well in defining the goals of the revolution. In Karenni and Chin State, we've seen these new administrative councils created, and they're really thinking about how do we create policies for a more just and I guess equal Myanmar. How do we, create these foundations now during the revolution? And
Mhm.
that's not to say that different armed actors and armed groups, don't exploit their power. And certainly in all the conversations I've had with people over the course of my career, like even before the coup, you know, um, having weapons really, it's not. It is a form of power, and people don't necessarily respect that form of power because they are afraid of it. But I think, like, again, to come back to this sort of difference between the Myanmar military as an institution, the kind of institutions it has embedded in politics and the economy and society, versus what the sort of goals of the revolutionary, leaders are. Even the Karen National Union, the area that I'm most familiar with and the area that I've
Mhm.
worked in for a long time. Like I said, they've got access to justice. They've got the most progressive land policies, including sort of, they have this incredible Indigenous-led conservation park. They have, some of the strongest policies to support women, including, in sort of their justice system. And,
So it's like governance in
yes,
spite of war.
yeah, and yes, at the end of the day, they are an armed institution, but they are the most, like, in terms of how they're thinking about, um, they're really grappling with how do we create a society where human rights are respected, where access to justice is available for all groups, whether you're from like a religious or ethnic minority, within Karen State, for example. That's not to say it's a perfect process. It takes time. And, like you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, like, I mean, I don't think it's really for us in the West to even, you know, say that, we come with the perfect models, because we simply don't.
Yeah.
And, I guess I think this is also what really gives me hope about this. Like, people in Myanmar really recognize that so many forms of injustice at every level. So there's ethnic injustice, there's discrimination against religious minorities, there's discrimination against women, LGBTQI communities, but also, like, there is a class consciousness as well. There is a lot of understanding of the, I guess, the struggles of ordinary people. And I think what's interesting about this, I guess, revolutionary movement, and is for some people it's also partly infused with Buddhist principles around the importance of nonviolence, which is, I guess,
Yeah.
really interesting for this discussion, right? Because it seems ironic for people who really strongly believe in nonviolence to engage in acts of violence. And actually, one of my really close friends that I spent a lot of time with in Pa'an in Quran State. He, I remember when I first met him, he came from this area which is famous for being from this very famous monk who spoke about the nonviolence and practiced nonviolence, and it became this sort of safe harbor. It's known as Tamanya, of people to flee from violence, and he's now leading one of these People's Defense Force groups. And I spoke with him last year about, how does someone who's Buddhist really reconcile the use of violence? And he said, I've been forced into this. I have no choice. But, the goals for me is not to create another sort of form of, military authoritarianism, or
Yeah.
to use, the power of the gun to have power over people. It's really to create a new kind of world. And for me, it's actually much more hopeful, the conversations that are happening in Myanmar amongst sort of, I guess, pro-democracy revolutionary forces than are even occurring in, say, like my own country, Australia, where I think we take for granted a lot of so certainly we take for granted a lot of the things that we have, but we also don't necessarily always recognize the injustices that are in our face. And yeah, I mean, I do genuinely think that, of course there are going to be struggles, and there are going to be people who take advantage of the power of violence. But I think this is a genuinely revolutionary movement in terms of the ideals and goals, particularly of young people, in the kind of transformations they want to see for Myanmar as a whole.
That's great. No, that was the perfect answer to a question that had no question mark on it.
I mean, I don't know if I really answered
That's
it. I mean,
great.
I'm grappling with this
Yeah.
myself, but I think the most important thing is for us, it's not for us to judge. I
Yeah.
think at the end of the day, this is the people of Myanmar, it's their revolutionary war, right? So it's not for me to say when you should or
Yeah.
shouldn't engage in acts of violence, right? If you
You don't
if
tell
you see
oppressed
your
people how to get free. Like, that's not a
right,
thing. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. I mean, and particularly if we consider the acts of barbarity that people have witnessed and experienced now, but, for decades. Especially for me, I work with Karen people, and I've been talking with IDP communities recently, and this isn't the first cycle of violence that they've fled from. They've been
Mhm.
fleeing violence since the 1980s, and, it's you can't give advice for how one should respond um, to these sort of cycles of violence.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I'm trying to help us learn from it, which is why you're
Yeah,
here.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
all right. I'm conscious of your time. Just in terms of like looking to the future,
Hmm.
how, how, it's a big question, I suppose.
Yeah,
How does this conflict end? Like, what can the rest of the world do to support peace and democracy in Myanmar? Like, and
yeah,
the most immediate thing that comes to mind is the question about, diplomatic recognition of the national
mm,
unity government. Is that
yeah,
is that the most representative form of the pro-democracy revolution? Is there other stuff that comes to mind? Immediate
yeah.
demands that are in the air?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's really important to keep in mind, and I think this is also something that, like, maybe the West really struggles with this revolutionary movement, is there is no one leader. And I mean, if there was one, it would be Aung San Suu Kyi, but she's in prison. But she also just no longer represents the revolutionary movement where it's sort of come over the last
Yeah.
3 years. Um, and I think there are so many incredible, I guess, forms of bodies that are being created alongside the national unity government. So they are generally the body that's sort of working on the international stage and sort of promoting like bringing to light what's happening in Myanmar, but also really trying to, I guess, come up with a vision of what a future federal democracy might look like in Myanmar. and they are engaged with different civil society organizations, different, ethnic armed organizations as well. But they can't speak for everyone in Myanmar, and in some respects they are, you know, they aren't the ones on the ground fighting this revolutionary war. So I think it's
Right.
important to keep that in mind. But I think, I'm a big proponent of thinking about the question of humanitarian relief, but also like, directly engaging with all these incredible civil society organizations, indigenous led networks, ethnic minority sort of networks as well, that are, getting humanitarian relief to people who have fled from violence. I think that's still a huge problem because a lot of the UN organizations and donors are still sort of questioning how do we provide humanitarian relief to these areas that are controlled by the resistance versus, say, areas controlled by the Myanmar military.
Mm-hmm.
And there are organizations that have decades of experience of doing that, and they still don't have enough funds. So I think there's definitely the importance of humanitarian relief is huge. But I also think that because of the sort of creation of all these different, organizations that are thinking about a future federal Myanmar, how do we create policies? I think that this is the time for engagement as well with these organizations, including with ethnic armed organizations. The Karen National Union, for example, they are developing a climate emissions strategy for the area that they control. And, they're really taking seriously, like, how do we as an armed and governance organization think about climate change?
Yeah.
And, so they provide access to justice, they provide education, they provide healthcare. They aren't just a typical sort of non-state armed group which is extracting from local populations. They are really thinking about their communities that they represent, and they hold a lot of legitimacy amongst the communities they represent as well. But I think that this is really a time to engage in these kinds of bodies that are really thinking about a future Myanmar. I was also just talking to a group of people yesterday because I also work on issues related to land and climate change. And people are like, how can we engage with some of these groups in thinking about designing policies that are really about ensuring people's land rights, for example, after the military has created land policies that really undermine people's land rights. So it's
Yeah.
in all sort of aspects, and I think like the Western world is still really grappling with like the fact that the resistance now controls more than 50% of the country, and they are going to defeat the military. How long that's going to take is another question. But particularly in the last 6 months, we've seen a rapid escalation from the resistance forces, particularly led by ethnic armed organizations. And, for example, in Western Rakhine State, which is where the Rohingya live, the Arakan army nearly control the whole state, and they've taken key sort of borderland trading posts as well. You could say the same in Kachin State. Nearly the whole border with China is controlled by ethnic armed organizations. Nearly the whole border with Thailand is controlled by the Karen National Union and the KMPP, the Karenni National Progressive Party. So I think like it's really time for the West, but other outside actors is also to sort of really grapple with the realities of what's happening in Myanmar, and that despite all of these odds against them, despite just 3 years of enduring so many acts of violence from the military at all levels, right, whether that's through airstrikes or whether that's through people putting people in prison, people are winning. They're winning
Yeah.
this revolution. And I think it's really important to engage with some of these actors who are actually thinking about the future, because the question of how to bring such a diverse and incredible sort of array of people together and create, I guess, a more hopeful future should be, I guess, a priority from my perspective. And there are already people thinking about that, right? But I think it's so important to support those initiatives, give them money, give them funding, support in technical advice where it's needed and where it's wanted. Because at the end of the day, as I've sort of said, like, this revolution is being led by the people. They've basically had virtually had no support from the international community in terms of funding. It's being funded by the community itself. So I think to come in very humbly and sort of open to hearing what people want from us, rather than us dictating, how we think their future should look like.
That makes sense. Well, the article is called "Living with Revolution: The Everyday Experiences of Myanmar's Gen Z Revolutionaries." This has been awesome, Justine
Yeah,
Chambers.
thank you
Thanks
so
for
much.
coming on. Yeah, this is
Yeah, and can I just say also, I just want to say thanks as well to all the people we spoke to for the article, and thank you for your interest. But at the end of the day, this article wouldn't be out there without the sacrifices being made by young people. So please, I guess do keep Myanmar's young people in your mind.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you. Thanks for, being real in like the realest way
Thanks.
imaginable. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
it's been a really nice chat.